The island appeared first as a smudge of volcanic ash against the copper dawn, its ridgelines traced in smoke that climbed without wind into the stratosphere. It was March 1945, and the black sand beaches of Iwo Jima still radiated heat from the previous day's naval bombardment, a warmth that mixed with the salt spray and created a fog that clung to the waterline like gauze over a wound. The Marines who waded ashore that morning expected resistance. They had been briefed on pillboxes, on interlocking fields of fire, on the likelihood of casualties measured in the thousands. What they did not expect, what no amount of briefing could prepare them for, was the silence. For 3 hours after the first wave landed, the island gave nothing back. No muzzle flash, no mortar crump, no rifle crack. Just the hiss of surf and the metallic click of entrenching tools biting into volcanic grit. The contradiction sat heavy in every foxhole. An enemy infamous for fanatical aggression had gone quiet, and that quiet felt more dangerous than any Banzai scream. 60 miles to the southeast, aboard the command ship El Dorado, a woman named Lieutenant Evelyn Kowalczyk sat in a steel cubicle no larger than a broom closet, headphones clamped over her ears, transcribing radio traffic from forward observer teams scattered across the beachhead. Her call sign was Axiom 6, and her job was to collate fire mission requests, cross-reference them against ammunition reserves aboard the offshore cruisers and destroyers, and route the data to the gunnery plotting rooms 3 decks below. She had been doing this work for 11 months, since Saipan, and she had learned to read the tempo of a battle in the cadence of the voices that crackled through her headset. Today the tempo was wrong. The forward observers were calling for illumination rounds, for white phosphorus to mark suspected cave mouths, but there were no calls for immediate suppression, no frantic requests for danger-close fire missions. The Marines were ashore, digging in, and the Japanese were waiting. Evelyn circled a grid coordinate on her plotting sheet and underlined it twice. Something was coming. The doctrine had a name, though few Americans would learn it until after the war. Gyokusai, shattered jewel. It was the term Japanese commanders used to describe the tactic of massed human wave assaults, charges that accepted total annihilation as the price of inflicting maximum casualties and demonstrating unbreakable spirit. The logic was ancient, rooted in samurai codes that valorized death over surrender, but the application was modern, a calculated response to American firepower superiority. If Japanese infantry could close the distance before artillery and machine guns, could establish effective fields of fire, if they could overwhelm perimeter defenses through sheer momentum and willingness to die, then the material advantage of the Americans would collapse into close-quarters chaos, where courage and cold steel mattered more than industrial capacity. The philosophy had been tested on Guadalcanal, refined on Tarawa, and perfected on Saipan, where thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians had charged American lines in the pre-dawn darkness, some armed only with sharpened bamboo stakes, others clutching live grenades to their chests, all of them screaming a single word: Banzai. 10,000 years, the war cry of an empire that had promised its people they would never lose. But by the spring of 1945, something had shifted in the arithmetic of slaughter. The Americans had brought to the Pacific Islands not just more men and more bullets, but an entire industrial ecosystem of destruction, a supply chain so vast and so relentless that it turned every beachhead into a temporary industrial city within hours of the first landing. The landing ships that disgorged Marines onto the black sand also disgorged pallets of ammunition, crates of rations, jerry cans of fuel, coils of communication wire, and most critically, the components of a mobile artillery park that could be assembled, ranged, and brought to bear faster than any army in history. The artillery pieces themselves were marvels of mass production. M2A-105 howitzers that weighed less than 2 tons could be broken down and moved by 6-man teams, and fired high-explosive shells at a rate of 4 rounds per minute out to a range of 7 miles. The shells were fused for either impact detonation or airburst, and each one contained enough steel fragmentation to shred a basketball court-sized area into a kill zone where nothing above ground survived. A single battalion of these guns, 18 tubes, could place 72 shells into a target grid every 60 seconds, and the Americans were landing with dozens of battalions. The logistics were staggering, and they represented a kind of warfare that the Japanese High Command had failed to fully comprehend. Every Marine rifle company that went ashore was backed by a fire support coordination center, a small tent or dugout where forward observers with radio sets could call in artillery strikes within minutes of spotting enemy movement. The observers carried nothing heavier than a map, a compass, a radio, and a pair of binoculars, but they were linked by invisible threads of radio frequency to the gun batteries offshore and to the howitzer emplacements being dug into the beach terraces. When an observer called a fire mission, 8-digit grid target description requested effect. The request traveled back to Axiom 6 and her counterparts aboard the command ships, where it was logged, prioritized, and relayed to the battery commanders. The battery commanders consulted firing tables, adjusted for wind and temperature, and gave the command to load and fire. From the moment the observer spotted the target to the moment the first shell detonated, the average elapsed time was 90 seconds. The Japanese called this kind of responsive fire Arashi no Tetsu, the Iron Storm. They had no equivalent and no answer. Evelyn Kowalczyk had not set out to become a fire support coordinator. She had studied mathematics at the University of Wisconsin, graduated in 1942 with a degree in statistics and a vague plan to teach high school algebra, and had enlisted in the Navy because the recruiting poster promised travel and technical training and a chance to serve something larger than herself. The training had taken place in Washington, D.C., in a converted boarding school where 200 women learned radio procedure, artillery ballistics, and the phonetic alphabet while sleeping 4 to a room and drilling twice a week in a parking lot with broom handles instead of rifles. The instructors were older men, gunnery sergeants with crushed hats and tobacco-stained fingers, and they had been skeptical at first. But the skepticism evaporated when it became clear that the women could plot firing solutions faster and more accurately than most of the male radio men who had rotated back from Guadalcanal. Evelyn finished second in her class and was assigned to the El Dorado with the specific task of managing fire missions during amphibious assaults. She had been in combat for 11 months, and in that time she had coordinated more than 4,000 individual artillery strikes, most of them called in by men she would never meet, against targets she would never see. She kept a notebook in her footlocker, a small leather-bound journal where she recorded not the missions themselves but the voices, call signs, accents, the occasional joke or curse that slipped through the radio discipline. Hawkeye 2 says his boots melted. Mohawk 7 wants to know if we can drop one on the cave with the red flag. Tomcat 3 sounds 18 years old, praying he makes it. The first Banzai charge on Iwo Jima came on the night of March 8th, 3 days into the battle, and it came not as a wild human wave but as a calculated probe, a test of American reaction time. The Japanese had spent 72 hours watching the Marines dig in, watching the supply dumps grow, watching the howitzers being towed into revetments, and the ammunition pallets being stacked under camouflage netting. They had counted the gun barrels, estimated the rate of fire, and concluded, correctly, that a daylight charge would be annihilated before it covered 100 yards. So they waited for darkness, for the hours between midnight and dawn when visibility dropped to 10 feet, and the Americans would be reliant on flares and guesswork. At 2:30 hours, a company of Japanese infantry, perhaps 200 men, emerged from a network of tunnels on the northern slope of Mount Suribachi and began moving south toward the marine perimeter. They moved in silence, no battle cries, no bugles, just the shuffle of boots on ash and the faint metallic clink of rifle slings. The lead elements got within 50 yards of the American lines before a Marine sentry heard them, fired a single shot, and triggered the flares. The flares hung in the sky like burning magnesium, casting the slope in harsh white light that turned every shadow into a trench and every rock into a bunker. The Japanese hesitated, caught between the instinct to charge and the rational understanding that they were silhouetted against the light. And in that moment of hesitation, the Marine Company commander called for fire. His call sign was Dagger 6, and his message to Axiom was terse. Grid 5578-4 for 2-3, troops in open, immediate suppression over. Evelyn copied the message, checked it against her map. The grid was inside the Marine perimeter, dangerously close to friendly positions, and relayed it with a priority flag to the battery aboard the destroyer Laffey. The battery commander, a lieutenant from Ohio named Marsh, acknowledged, consulted his firing table and gave the order. Load VT, charge 5, elevation 800 mils, fire for effect. The VT stood for variable time, a proximity fuse that detonated the shell 30 feet above the ground, turning each round into a cloud of steel fragments that scythed through anything in its path. The first salvo, 6 rounds, left the Laffey's deck and arced through the darkness, and 18 seconds later the slope of Suribachi erupted in a sequence of airbursts that looked, from the command ship, like a string of camera flashes going off in sequence. The Japanese charge disintegrated. The men who survived the initial barrage, perhaps a third of the company, broke and ran, not back toward their tunnels but forward into the teeth of the Marine perimeter, where they were cut down by interlocking machine gun fire before they covered 10 yards. The entire engagement lasted less than 5 minutes, and when the sun rose 3 hours later, the Marine burial details counted 163 Japanese bodies on the slope, arranged in rough clusters that marked where the airbursts had caught them. There were no American casualties. Evelyn logged the mission in her notebook, noted the time and the ammunition expenditure, 36 5-inch VT shells, and moved on to the next fire request. But she underlined the mission number twice, and in the margin she wrote a single sentence. They tried to adapt. We were faster. The adaptation was not limited to the Americans. By mid-March, Japanese commanders across the Pacific had begun receiving reports from survivors of Banzai charges, reports that described not just the volume of American firepower, but its precision, its responsiveness, its ability to shift from target to target with a speed that seemed almost telepathic. The reports were collated, analyzed, and forwarded to Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, where staff officers pored over them in dimly lit offices and tried to calculate a response. The conclusion was bleak. The tactic of massed frontal assault, which had been the cornerstone of Japanese defensive doctrine since 1942, was no longer viable against an enemy who could bring coordinated artillery fire to bear within seconds of contact. The Americans were not winning because they were braver or more skilled. The reports were clear on this point, but because they had industrialized violence in a way that rendered individual courage irrelevant. A single American forward observer, sitting in a foxhole with a radio, could call down more destructive power in 60 seconds than an entire Japanese infantry battalion could deliver in an hour. The mathematics were undeniable, and they pointed toward a future in which the Japanese would either abandon the Banzai charge altogether or find a way to neutralize American artillery superiority. They chose neither. Instead, they doubled down, committing to even larger charges, reasoning that if a company-sized assault could be stopped by artillery, then a regiment-sized assault, 2,000 men moving at once, might overwhelm the American ability to coordinate fire and create enough chaos to allow a breakthrough. The logic was desperate, a gambler's fallacy that mistook scale for solution, but it was the only logic left to an empire that had no industrial capacity to match American production and no strategic depth to trade space for time. The orders went out to every Japanese garrison still holding territory in the Pacific. Prepare for final defensive operations, conserve ammunition for close combat, and when the Americans land, hit them with everything at once. The code name for the operation was Ketsugo, decisive operation, and it called for synchronized Banzai charges timed to coincide with American amphibious landings. The idea being that if the charges could be launched while the Americans were still unloading supplies and setting up their gun positions, there might be a narrow window of vulnerability, a few hours where the artillery could be disrupted and the perimeter collapsed. The test case came on Okinawa, the largest of the Ryukyu Islands and the last stepping stone before the Japanese home islands. The Americans landed on April 1, 1945, and for the first 2 weeks the fighting was sporadic, almost tentative, as the Japanese pulled back into the island's rugged southern interior and the Americans pushed forward cautiously, expecting ambushes at every ridgeline. But on the night of April 12th, the Japanese launched the first of what would become known as the Okinawa Banzai offensives, a coordinated series of charges involving more than 5,000 troops, all of them committed to a single thrust aimed at the American center. The attack began at 2200 hours, under a waning crescent moon that gave just enough light to navigate by but not enough to shoot by. The Japanese moved in columns, each column led by an officer with a sword, and they advanced without firing, relying on speed and silence to close the distance before the Americans could react. They almost succeeded. The lead elements reached the American perimeter and breached it in 3 places, overrunning a machine gun position and forcing a platoon of Marines to pull back into a secondary defensive line. For 10 minutes, an eternity in combat time, the outcome was uncertain, the kind of close-quarters melee where artillery and air power were useless, and the fight came down to rifle butts and bayonets and hand grenades thrown at arm's length. But then the American fire support network kicked in. Forward observers with the retreating platoons managed to get their radios working, managed to call in grids even as they fell back under fire, and within 3 minutes the first artillery shells were landing on the Japanese columns that were still moving forward, still trying to exploit the breach. The shells came from 6 different batteries, Marine howitzers on the ridgelines, Army 155 guns dug in 5 miles to the rear, and naval gunfire from destroyers offshore, and they came in a coordinated pattern that had been rehearsed hundreds of times in training. The pattern was called a box barrage. 4 linear concentrations of fire, one on each side of a square grid, designed to trap anything inside and prevent reinforcement or escape. The Japanese columns walked into the box and were annihilated, cut to pieces by high explosive and white phosphorus that turned the night into a flickering orange hell. By dawn, the attack was over. The Marines reoccupied their original positions, buried their dead, 23 men, and counted more than 3,000 Japanese bodies in the kill zones. The ratio was 130-1, a number so lopsided it barely seemed real, and it prompted an urgent dispatch from the Marine Division commander to Pacific Fleet headquarters. Enemy continues to employ massed frontal assaults despite prohibitive casualties. Recommend dissemination of counter-battery procedures to all echelons. The dispatch was passed to Evelyn Kowalczyk, who logged it, filed it, and then pulled out her notebook and wrote a longer entry than usual. They know it doesn't work. They know we'll cut them down, but they keep coming. Why? Is it courage or is it despair? Does it matter? The answer, to the extent there was one, lay in the intersection of culture and logistics, 2 forces that shaped the Pacific War in ways that neither side fully articulated at the time. The Japanese military, for all its tactical sophistication, operated under assumptions that had been formed in an earlier era, an era when industrial output was measured in thousands of tons rather than millions, when armies fought with bolt-action rifles and horse-drawn artillery, and when the outcome of battles was determined by the morale and training of individual soldiers rather than by the throughput of supply depots and the efficiency of transportation networks. The Banzai charge was, in this context, a rational tactic. It leveraged Japan's strengths, discipline, willingness to sacrifice, esprit de corps, and sought to negate the enemy's strengths by closing to contact before firepower could be brought to bear. It had worked against the Chinese in Manchuria, where the enemy lacked modern artillery and air support. It had worked, to a limited extent, against the British in Malaya, where surprise and speed had compensated for material inferiority. But it did not work against the Americans, not because the Americans were better soldiers on an individual level, but because the Americans had built a war machine that rendered individual soldiering almost secondary to the broader question of how much steel and explosives could be delivered to a target grid within a given time frame. The machine had components, and each component was a study in industrial design and logistical coordination. Start with the ammunition. A single 105 high-explosive shell weighed 33 pounds, contained 7 pounds of TNT, and cost the U.S. government approximately $4 to manufacture. At peak production in 1944, American factories were producing 2 million shells per month, a number that included not just the projectiles themselves but the brass casings, the fuses, the propellant charges, and the wooden pallets used to ship them. The shells were packed in wooden crates, 12 to a crate, and the crates were loaded onto Liberty ships in ports up and down the East Coast, Baltimore, Norfolk, Charleston, Savannah, and then sailed across the Atlantic to the Panama Canal, through the canal to the Pacific, and then west across 5,000 miles of open ocean to forward supply depots in Hawaii, the Marshalls, and the Marianas. The voyage took 30 days, and by the time the ships reached the forward areas they were part of a conveyor belt that ran continuously, a logistical bloodstream that fed the gun batteries and never stopped flowing. Unloading the ships was its own engineering challenge. The early campaigns, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, had relied on manual labor, on teams of stevedores who hauled crates off the ships by hand, a process that took days and resulted in massive bottlenecks on the beaches. But by 1944, the Americans had mechanized the process, deploying fleets of forklifts, cranes, and amphibious vehicles that could drive straight from the ship's hold onto the beach and inland to the supply dumps. The forklifts were civilian models, purchased in bulk from manufacturers like Clark and Yale and Town, and then modified for saltwater environments and rough terrain. Each forklift could move 2 tons of cargo at a time, and a single ship could be unloaded in 8 hours if the weather cooperated and the beach party had enough equipment. The speed mattered because the artillery batteries consumed ammunition at a prodigious rate. An active howitzer battery could burn through 300 rounds in a single day of heavy fighting, and the supply chain had to be fast enough to keep up with demand. The alternative was rationing, which meant slower response times to fire missions, which meant higher American casualties. The entire system was optimized for one goal: bring overwhelming firepower to bear, faster than the enemy can react, and never let the guns run dry. The women who coordinated this system were known, informally, as the Fire Angels, a nickname that had started as a joke among the Marine forward observers and had stuck because it captured something true about the work they did. They sat in steel cubicles aboard ships, or in tents dug into hillsides, or in bunkers reinforced with sandbags and corrugated tin, and they listened to voices over radio sets and translated those voices into grids and coordinates and ammunition types and priority codes. They did not see the explosions, did not see the bodies, did not see the men they saved or the men they killed. They saw only the paperwork: message slips, plotting sheets, fire mission logs, carbon copies filed in triplicate. But they heard the voices, and over time the voices became familiar, became people, and the people became a kind of congregation that existed only in the ether, linked by radio frequency and shared danger. Evelyn Kowalczyk knew Dagger 6 by his slow Midwestern drawl and his habit of saying, "much obliged," after every fire mission. She knew Hawkeye 2 by his rapid-fire Boston accent and his tendency to request white phosphorus even when high explosive would do. She knew Tomcat 3 by his young voice, barely post-pubescent, and by the way he always sounded terrified but never broke procedure. She prayed for all of them, even though she wasn't particularly religious, and she tracked their call signs in her notebook, making a small check mark next to each one after a mission, and a small cross next to the ones she never heard from again. By May 1945, the crosses outnumbered the check marks. The largest Banzai charge of the war came on the night of May 4th, on Okinawa, and it involved nearly 10,000 Japanese troops drawn from 3 different infantry regiments and a naval landing force that had been stranded on the island when the Imperial Navy pulled back to defend the home islands. The attack was planned as a coordinated offensive along a 6-mile front, timed to begin at 200 hours and aimed at 3 separate sectors of the American line. The idea being that if all 3 attacks hit at once, the Americans would not have enough artillery to cover all the gaps, and at least one of the thrusts would break through. The Japanese commanders knew the odds were long. They had seen the casualty ratios from earlier charges, had read the after-action reports from Iwo Jima and Peleliu, but they believed, or needed to believe, that a sufficiently large attack, sufficiently well coordinated, could still succeed. The orders went out on May 3rd, written in brush calligraphy on rice paper and delivered by runner to the battalion commanders who would lead the assault. The orders were brief: attack at 200. Objective: enemy artillery positions. Method: shock and speed. Expected result: death with honor. The Americans knew the attack was coming. They didn't know the exact timing, but they had seen the signs. Increased radio chatter in Japanese, sightings of troop movements in the valleys south of the Shuri line, reports from POWs who talked about final operations and decisive battle. The Marine and Army Division commanders held a coordination meeting on May 3rd and agreed on a defensive posture. Pull the forward platoons back slightly. Create a no-man's land of about 200 yards between the American perimeter and the likely jump-off points for the Japanese attack, and pre-register every artillery battery on the island to fire into that no-man's land on demand. The pre-registration was critical. It meant that the gun crews had already calculated the range, elevation, and deflection for every likely target grid, had already loaded the firing tables, had already stacked the ammunition within arm's reach of the guns. When the fire missions came in, there would be no delay, no need to consult maps or recalculate trajectories. The guns would simply fire, round after round, until the barrels glowed red and the crews rotated out for water breaks. Evelyn Kowalczyk spent May 3rd preparing for the attack in her own way, which meant checking and double-checking the radio frequencies, testing the backup generators, and making sure every plotting sheet in her cubicle was fresh and every pencil was sharp. She had learned over 11 months of combat that the details mattered, that a smudged grid coordinate or a misheard call sign could mean the difference between a successful fire mission and a friendly fire incident, and she had developed a set of rituals, small, repetitive actions, that helped her stay calm under pressure. She checked her watch against the ship's chronometer, checked her headset for static, checked the message slips to make sure they were stacked in the right order. And then at 2,000 hours she sat down, put on the headset and waited. The attack began at 2:07 hours, 7 minutes late, which suggested either poor coordination or last-minute hesitation among the Japanese commanders. It began not with a Banzai scream but with a rolling barrage of mortar fire, Japanese 81 rounds that walked up and down the American line, searching for bunkers and communication trenches. The barrage lasted 10 minutes, and then it stopped, and in the silence that followed the Japanese infantry began to move. They came in waves, each wave separated by about 50 yards, and they advanced at a jog, rifles held at port arms, moving through the darkness with a discipline that spoke to months of rehearsal. The lead wave reached the no-man's land, crossed it, and was within 100 yards of the American perimeter when the flares went up. And then the artillery opened fire. It came from everywhere at once, from the Marine howitzers on the ridgelines and the Army 155 guns in the rear areas and the battleship New Mexico offshore. Its 14-inch rifles trained on the valley floors and loaded with shells that weighed 1,400 pounds each, and carried enough explosive to vaporize anything within a 50-yard radius. The fire was coordinated through a network of radio links that ran from the forward observers to Axiom 6 and her counterparts aboard the command ships, and from the command ships to the battery commanders who controlled the guns. Each fire mission was logged, prioritized, and executed within seconds, and the result was a barrage that fell like a curtain across the no man's land, a curtain that moved forward and backward according to the needs of the observers, adjusting in real time to the flow of the battle. The Japanese waves hit the barrage and crumpled entire companies, ceasing to exist in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The survivors tried to push through, tried to close the distance, but the barrage followed them, adjusted to their movements, anticipated their routes. Within 20 minutes, the attack on the first sector had collapsed. Within 40 minutes, the attacks on the second and third sectors had collapsed. By 300 hours, less than an hour after the attack began, it was over. The dawn revealed the cost. The Americans counted more than 6,000 Japanese dead in the kill zones, most of them within 200 yards of the American perimeter, their bodies torn and burnt beyond recognition by high explosive and white phosphorus. The American casualties were fewer than 200, most of them wounded by the Japanese mortar barrage that had preceded the main attack. The ratio, 30-1, was reported up the chain of command, analyzed and filed away, but the analysts knew that the ratio itself was almost meaningless, that it obscured as much as it revealed. The ratio said nothing about the psychological cost of standing in a foxhole and watching thousands of men charge toward you, knowing that most of them would die before they got close enough to matter. It said nothing about the industrial effort required to deliver the volume of artillery fire that had stopped the charge, the factories and railroads and ships and forklifts and radio networks that made the barrage possible. And it said nothing about the men who had died, who had charged into certain death because their orders and their culture demanded it, who had been brave and disciplined and utterly, catastrophically wrong about the nature of the war they were fighting. Evelyn Kowalczyk wrote 2 entries in her notebook that night. The first was professional, a log of the fire mission she had coordinated. May 45, 2070-300 HRS, 127 fire missions logged, estimated 4,000 rounds expended, all targets serviced, no friendly fire incidents. The second entry was personal and it was brief. I have helped kill 6,000 men tonight. I do not know if this makes me a patriot or a monster. I think it makes me both. The end of the Banzai charge as a viable tactic came not with a formal order but with a slow, grinding realization that spread through the Japanese military over the summer of 1945. The realization was simple: massed frontal assaults against an enemy with overwhelming firepower superiority were not just costly but suicidal, and suicide without the possibility of strategic success was not honor but waste. The realization came too late to save most of the men who had been committed to the charges, but it came in time to shape the final defensive plans for the Japanese home islands, plans that called for dispersed, small-unit tactics, for ambushes and delaying actions rather than climactic set-piece battles. The plans were never fully implemented, because the war ended in August with the atomic bombs and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, but the shift in doctrine was real, and it marked the final admission that the empire's military philosophy, forged in an earlier century, could not survive contact with industrial-age warfare. The Americans, for their part, drew their own lessons from the Banzai charges, lessons that would shape military doctrine for the next half-century. The primary lesson was logistical, that firepower was only as effective as the supply chain that fed it, and that the supply chain required not just trucks and ships, but radios and coordination networks, and the kind of mathematical precision that could only be achieved by trained specialists working in real time. The specialists, the Evelyn Kowalczyks and the forward observers and the battery commanders, became the backbone of a new way of fighting, a way that emphasized coordination over courage, systems over heroics, and the cold logic of target grids over the hot blood of close combat. It was a less romantic vision of warfare, one that left little room for the kind of individual valor that had defined earlier conflicts, but it was ruthlessly effective, and effectiveness was what mattered when the stakes were measured in tens of thousands of lives. Evelyn Kowalczyk rotated home in September 1945, 5 weeks after the Japanese surrender, and she never spoke publicly about her work during the war. She returned to Wisconsin, finished a graduate degree in statistics, and took a job with a life insurance company, calculating actuarial tables and mortality rates, work that was, in its own way, not so different from the work she had done aboard the El Dorado. She married late, had no children, and lived quietly until her death in 1998. Her notebooks were found among her effects, donated to a county historical society, and eventually digitized and made available to researchers who study the logistics of mid-century warfare. The notebooks are remarkable for their precision and their restraint, for the way they document thousands of fire missions without once lapsing into editorializing or sentiment. But there are exceptions, moments where the professional facade cracks and something more human emerges. One entry dated June 15, 1945, reads simply, Tomcat 3 KIA. He was 19. I heard him die over the radio. I wish I knew his real name. The legacy of the Banzai charge is contested, argued over by historians and veterans and descendants of the men who fought. Some see it as evidence of fanaticism, a symptom of a militaristic culture that valued death over reason. Others see it as a tragic expression of loyalty and duty, of men who did what their leaders demanded even when they knew the odds were hopeless. Both interpretations are probably true and probably incomplete. What is not contested is the arithmetic, that the charges failed consistently and catastrophically, and that they failed because the men who launched them were fighting a war of 19th century values against an enemy who had industrialized violence and turned it into a science. The Americans did not win because they were braver. They won because they had built a machine, a vast, unglamorous, deeply unsexy machine made of radios and howitzers and forklifts and plotting sheets, and because they had trained people like Evelyn Kowalczyk to run the machine with a precision that bordered on the inhuman. The machine worked, and 10,000 men died proving it. On clear nights in the Pacific, even now, even 80 years later, you can sometimes see the flares. They are not real flares, of course, are stars or satellites, or the running lights of container ships crossing the dark water. But if you know the history, if you have walked the beaches and read the after-action reports and held the rusted shell casings that still wash up with every high tide, you can imagine the light, hanging suspended above the volcanic ash, casting shadows that no longer exist. And if you listen carefully, over the hiss of the surf and the distant thrum of ship engines, you might hear the voices, call signs and coordinates, requests for fire and confirmations of hits, the strange liturgy of men and women coordinating the end of other men's lives. The voices are gone now, scattered into the static of history, but the system they built remains, encoded in doctrine and training manuals and the deep institutional memory of armed forces that still, even today, prize coordination over heroics and logistics over valor. The lesson of the Banzai charge is not that courage fails, but that courage without an adequate supply chain is just another form of suicide. And the Americans, more than any other nation in the war, understood that the supply chain was the weapon, and everything else, the ships and planes and howitzers, was just the delivery mechanism. The last recorded Banzai charge of World War II took place on Okinawa on August 14, 1945, hours before the Japanese surrender was announced. It involved a single company of Japanese troops, perhaps 150 men, who emerged from caves in the southern part of the island and charged an American perimeter under the white sun of mid-afternoon. They got within 70 yards before the artillery caught them, a single concentrated barrage that lasted less than a minute and left nothing moving in the kill zone. There were no American casualties. The Marine Forward Observer who called in the fire mission logged it as routine, another grid serviced, another threat eliminated. He did not know, and could not have known, that he had just witnessed the end of a doctrine, the last gasp of a military philosophy that had shaped Asian warfare for centuries and would never be seen again. The shells he called down did not just kill men. They killed an idea, the idea that spirit and sacrifice could overcome material superiority, that courage could substitute for steel. The idea died hard, but it died, and the silence that followed was the silence of history turning a page. Years later, when veterans of the Pacific campaigns returned to the islands to lay wreaths and pay respects, they found the beaches had changed. The black sand had been covered over by new volcanic deposits. The pillboxes had been filled in or converted into tourist attractions, and the shell craters had been softened by rain and wind into shallow depressions where grass now grew. But the ordnance remained, buried in the soil, and every year a few shells worked their way to the surface, still live, still dangerous, small metal ghosts of a conflict that had reshaped the world. The islanders learned to recognize the shapes, the tapered nose of a mortar round, the cylindrical body of a howitzer shell, and they reported them to the authorities, who sent teams to detonate them in controlled explosions out in the jungle. The explosions were small, barely audible over the wind, but they served as reminders that the war had not ended cleanly, that it lingered in the ground like